All right, let's begin. I would ask who saw the keynote, but that's probably most people. Anybody did not see the keynote? Just raise your hand. Okay, a few people, right? I want to get a sense of what to focus on as we go through here. So we want to talk about Spring.io. I imagine if you, of course, were in the keynote, you saw the site. And how many have actually played around a little bit since then? Okay, cool. All right, so let's just set something up for a little bit later. Maybe load the site up on your phone, assuming you've got a suitable phone for that. And just make sure that it's up and loaded, and then we'll play around and have some fun later. Okay, so we can talk about a few things here. Of course, we'll talk about the site, the effort behind it, and so on. But in total, this might be the story of how we didn't end up here. Right? Let me ask a few more questions, right? We could talk about any and all of these, but just by show of hands, right? How many here would really like to hear about the goals behind this, the motivations that we had behind this, what we were trying to achieve by doing the site in this way? For how many is that interesting? Okay. And how about the functionality of the site itself? It was a pretty brief tour through the keynote, but we can give a real grand tour with this amount of time. For how many is that interesting? Okay, cool. And then how about the how? How we built it, what's under the hood? Okay, that's not most hands, right? Okay, that's good. That's what I was kind of hoping to focus on anyway. Well, let's start there. First goal was to build something useful, right? For experts and newcomers, right? So probably most of the people in this room are toward the expert side of the scale with regard to Spring. You've probably been around. How many are building Spring apps in production right now? Yeah, that's why you come to conferences like this, right? But how many of you work with people who don't know Spring very well or at all? Yeah? And how many of you have ever been in the position of explaining or maybe even defending Spring to some of those people, right? And you say, well, just look at the app, this is the way that it works, and then, maybe that app is 5 years old and it's full of old techniques in Spring, or you're pointing them at just some random guy's blog post on the internet about how to do something. Ironically, the Spring website itself hasn't always been the most useful resource, right? And the reference documentation that we've had has always been pretty good, I think it's fair to say, but it's also very detailed, right? The reference documentation approach that we've had kind of has the assumption that you're already using Spring or you've already made the choice to use Spring. And that's one of the things we wanted to address with this is basically dealing with the competitive landscape, right? You have a lot of choices. Things have come a long way in the last 10 years, and there are completely valid alternatives to various pieces and parts of Spring. So how do we really make the case? First of all, we have to justify why you would choose Spring. And that's what we see in a lot of the guides, right, is things that people should be able to consume very quickly and easily and, say, I really like what I saw, and then down the road, you're digging into the reference documentation. So filling in some gaps in resources. Build something useful, right? And that's a bit of a tough balance to meet the needs of both experts and newcomers. And ultimately, you guys will be the judge if we've done that well. But it's important to note that we were actually trying to do that. We didn't want to just build something for newcomers. We've already been building something for experts in the reference documentation. Try to get it right for both. So to get that right, it needs to be by developers, for developers. And I absolutely couldn't resist, because if this thing will play. Oh, it was an animated GIF, and it was really fun. Does it not work now? Oh, here we go. Maybe. Oh, it's loading. Okay. Yeah, wow. Seriously high bandwidth animated GIF. But, I've felt like this guy a few times over the last 6 months or so, making the case, even internally, right? This has got to make sense to developers. If we rebuild this site, it's got to actually feel like the team wrote that site, right? And so while it's a joke about Ballmer, we actually really mean it. We hope that that comes through, that it really has been our voice and our hands building that site, because indeed it has been. So some of the guiding principles, just no BS, right? If it's not useful, it's not there. Cut everything away from the site that we knew and replace with just pure utility and value. That's the goal. Again, you guys be the judge, but that's what we were driving at. Try to focus on solving developers' problems, right? Again, if you're in the keynote, like, what is it that we're all typing into Google these days when we're building an app? All kinds of, whether it's, again, building a RESTful web service or dealing with search or whatever it is, you're typing things in a task-oriented way into Google or into Stack Overflow. We'd better show up at that level. Spring had better show up as a solution to those problems, not as a collection of projects, right, that are just referencing themselves. We don't want to be self-referential here. Spring is not really the point. What Spring makes possible is the point. The productivity that Spring provides is the point. The comprehensive, cohesive way that Spring addresses that makes, hopefully, your life better. That's the point, right? So show that off. Okay, so goal number 2, that's goal number 1. That's basically for everybody out there, for all of you. Goal number 2 is really largely an internal goal, but I think it has effects for the outside world, is to eat our own dog food. And I like the way that John Davies said this, to eat our own quiche. It's a little more classy term, I guess. So what does that mean, to eat our own quiche? Well, there's a lot of quiche to eat, basically. The first one was, like I said in the keynote, we have these new bits that we're offering up for you guys to use. It would be a really good idea if we've used them ourselves. And this, to me, felt a lot like some of the earlier days on the Spring team. Spring was really born of using what was out there in enterprise application development in anger, right? And sometimes, indeed, making us very angry about the inefficiency or the difficulty of use and so on. And it was that frustration, that sort of practitioner's mindset that led to some of the really good things in Spring. It was really time to get back to that. Even taking a critical eye toward our own software, right? Where is Spring itself today the problem? Where is Spring itself slowing people down? And sort of have no sacred cows about that. Okay, and actually it went, I think, quite well. Really using Spring Boot to build this app, we changed many, many things inside of Boot as a direct function of building that. Spring Framework 4 is a little bit different. It was actually quite solid. We didn't really find any bugs underneath, which is reassuring. But it is all built on top of the milestone 2 of Spring Framework. We don't recommend you put apps in production on milestones, but we put this one in production on milestones. And then the second thing is, we've been sort of loosely associated with Cloud Foundry for a long time, right? How many of you use Cloud Foundry in any way? Yeah, okay, a few, right? For 4 years or however long ago we announced Cloud Foundry as part of VMware and so on, we've always been running Spring workloads on top of Cloud Foundry, generally advocating that people do that. The Cloud Foundry team has been working hard on making that a great experience. But the Spring team ourselves had never really dove in. And in terms of like building what we represent to the world, Spring, building it on top of Cloud Foundry, we'd never done something like that. And we'd seen those guys working so hard for the last, I don't even know how long, many, many months on Cloud Foundry. And it just really felt like it was time to test this out, like road test it for real. And for the most part, we've just had very, very positive interactions with the team there and with the technology. And of course, it's working to some degree, right? Because the site is up and running on Cloud Foundry now. So that's been really useful, I think. And then the last thing is, like we talked about in the keynote again, to bring together, this is a brand new company that we're under, teams that aren't necessarily working with each other or talking to each other every day, and to bring those together was, again, an internal goal, another kind of dog food to eat. So the third major goal, or many, many goals, but the third major one that's worth talking about is to build a reference application, to build one of what we hope will be a series of reference applications. But when I say reference application, I really mean it in a particular way, like non-trivial, real world, the kind of thing that takes man months or even, years to build, right? Fundamentally, what we're thinking of as a reference app here is defined maybe most directly as an app that has users in the world, right? Springsource.org, now spring.io, if nothing else, has users. In fact, let's just take a look at what's going on. So if we look at analytics, it's always interesting and kind of humbling to watch Google Analytics on this site. So this is actually not quite an accurate number yet because we haven't moved over all of the domains. If you notice, if you go to springsource.org right now, it's still up. But if you go to blog.springsource.org, that's all been redirected to the new site. So we've just been doing that step by step and carefully, and I'll probably finish moving .org over just after this talk. But if we look at real-time statistics on the site, like how many people are using the site right now, basically, around 300, right? 2, 3, 4 requests per second, right? Just depends on where the sun is, But at any given time of day, it's somewhere between 100 active users on the site and 600 or 700 active users on the site. This is measuring spring.io, right? It's mostly up and running, and it's mostly replaced all of the properties except for springsource.org again. So that number would obviously boost up if we had that there. But the point is, that's a site that has users. So one way or another, if you show that off as a reference app, it's going to have all the trappings, all the markings of a real-world app. You're going to see real-world compromises being made, trade-offs being made, right? And that's what I think as a practitioner, as an engineer, as a developer, that's what I want to see. I don't really want to see the idealized app. If I'm trying to learn something, I want to see the idealized app. If I'm trying to understand what it's going to be like in real life, it would be great to be able to look under the hood of an application like this. And that's why we're going to open source this in short order. So again, we hope to have more of these because this is just one kind of reference app. This is a web app, right? Of course, we have all kinds of other workloads that really deserve to have their own real-world applications. So yeah, we want to show how it's done with Spring and building a web app. But quite honestly, first, I think we had to relearn how that's done, right? Re-educate ourselves, have an honest moment of saying, for me personally, I didn't build the entire site. This was a team building it, right? But as someone helping to lead that effort, it's like, well, really, when is the last time I personally sat down to build one of these things? I mean, years. I've been building the framework for years. So a little bit of humility, right? And actually go look and see. And that's why, working with the folks at Pivotal Labs was huge for us because they're building stuff every single day, right? So they're up to date with the very latest techniques in web app development. Of course, we know the backend pretty well. We're paying attention to users' needs all day long, every day, what they're doing when they build apps. So it's not like we're utterly out of touch, but it makes a big difference to have your hands on, right? So we wanted to step back, relearn, and then figure out how we show the world how it ought to be done with regard to a Spring app. Okay, so much for motivations. Just any questions so far before we get into the into the functionality of the site? Yeah?
How often do you expect to update it? Meaning like Spring 4 goes into version 1 and then eventually GA?
Right, so the question is how often do we intend to update the site? Indeed, when underlying dependencies go GA, like we're on top of a milestone of Spring 4, Spring Framework 4 right now. We're on top of a milestone of Spring Boot. Well, since the keynote, let's put it this way, since the keynote, we've updated the site maybe 6 times, right? So, and there might be some more of that, right quick. So as it happens, basically, as we feel comfortable with things, then, deploy as frequently as possible and have a nice mechanism for rolling back if something doesn't work, right? Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
What happens to the old style documentation?
The old style documentation, so the reference documentation, API documentation, the question is what happens to that? Nothing, really. So it's still up. And actually, that's a pretty good segue. We can just jump into the site from there. So we'll zoom back out and take a bit more of a tour, but if you're looking for the reference documentation, there's two places that you could go. One is the quick reference, and if you're looking for Spring Framework documentation itself, there you are. And all those links are jumping off to, if you can see the URL, docs.spring.io. If you know those URLs well, you'll be familiar with static.springframework.org or static.springsource.org. That's simply the new name for that, for the box that's serving that. So it's all still there, right? And of course, that's an incalculable amount of time and work that's been put into that. We're not going to rewrite that stuff. It's actually quite useful still once you're ready to operate at that level. Once you're in the app building something with Spring Data JPA or with Spring Security, right? You just want to laser focus in on some reference documentation and read a chapter or two. Nothing wrong with that, right? So it's essentially status quo. It's just filling in the gaps in between of usability. So that's the quick reference, but also if you're navigating straight to the project that you're working on, in this case if it were Spring Framework or say Spring Security, you're getting to the project page there. And the project pages all have that same kind of quick reference up in the upper right to jump to the ref docs or API docs, just like it has for the, what version of this do I want to use? What do I want to get on my class path? Copy and paste that, right? Cool. Okay, so let's zoom back out and talk about the functionality of the site. So I gave a quick tour of this a couple nights ago, but let's breathe a little bit deeper as we go through it. You just saw the documentation quick reference, and again, it's just that. So it's really, I know what I want to go find it, don't waste my time, right? But if you're actually trying to figure out how to do something, you're not even maybe sure which part of Spring to use. That's really perhaps a better fit for getting started guides or tutorials, and those are linking off to the same place that this does up here, the guides link. Have that same kind of filter, so if you're wanting to build you want to do something RESTful, right? You can narrow down, filter down to just the things that deal with REST. For example, building a RESTful web service. And again, the getting started guides versus tutorials is, you can think of the first distinction there as time, right? So these are designed to be super quick, get you to hello world as fast as possible through working code, right? Through working code that you wrote from absolute scratch. So, it tells you what you're going to build. We're going to build something that's going to be up and running on 8080, and when you hit it with a GET request, it's going to give you back some JSON that says hello world. You'll customize a parameter along the way, right? Okay, so what do you need? The requirements are almost always the same in these by design. It is just, a few minutes of your time. Really, a text editor. You don't even need an IDE for this. Relatively modern JDK. And then a build system. If you choose to use Gradle, then it's already built in, right? You can, if you're cloning the repository, which you can do, feels a bit like GitHub controls, right? Or you can, of course, go to the repository and clone it. If you do that, you'll find that inside of each one of those, there's a Gradle wrapper, right? How many of you have ever used Gradle as a build system? Yeah, so you're probably familiar with the Gradle wrapper, which is basically a self-contained little build system, a self-contained bootstrapping build system, so you don't even have to download the build system itself. That's nice. And of course, if you're using Maven, the POM is there as well. One of the improvements that we'll make, now that we're done with the launch, is when you see instructions about the build file here, right? We focused on Gradle because we wanted to do the latest and greatest and what we generally recommend. And we do generally recommend Gradle. There are differences of opinion on the team, like any team with regard to build systems, but we tend to use Gradle throughout most of our projects. So we focused on that here. One of the things that we look forward to adding in is that kind of modal switch that you saw over on the project page when you're copying the dependency coordinates. We want to do that here, right? So I want to use Maven, show me Maven XML. I want to use Gradle, show me Gradle XML, and we'll just remember that with a cookie so that you never have to think about it again. But in any case, right, that's the story. Just follow the instructions, literally copy and paste these little chunks of code into your text editor, onto the file system. The instructions are really explicit, but also trying not to be verbose at all. Again, a kind of tough balance. And where you end up is running code, right? One of the things that I think worked out pretty well here is that because we built most of these on top of Spring Boot, you really don't see much boilerplate. In fact, most of the boilerplate, if you will, is build system code. Whether Gradle or Maven, just a little bit of stuff to set up, and you have to do that inside of every guide if you're really going to start from scratch. But from there, like, what's the next thing that you're getting into? Well, in this case, a representation class. That's of high value if you're building, a RESTful service. The next thing is a controller. That's of high value. That's relevant. That's definitely not boilerplate. And then pretty quickly, you're just bootstrapping the application through a main method. And then, adding some bits to the build again so that you can go grab what you need for dependencies. And then you're off and running. And if you haven't played around yet with Boot or looked into how Boot thinks about the world, this is kind of the first, most simple, most elementary way of running an app is just with java-jar, right? All the way back to basics. Why not run an application that way? What about this app couldn't be run just with an executable jar? If we embed the container, right, if we're running on top of Tomcat or Jetty or what have you, which are all options that Spring Boot gives you, if we're embedding the container, we can just run with java-jar. And it's not that you might not have reasons that you really want or need to run things in a war-style deployment, but it does make you ask the question, why? Why do I have to do something more complicated or more sophisticated than java-jar? You might have good reasons, but if you don't, consider doing this. And for the purposes of learning something, it doesn't get much easier, hopefully. Right, and so, in the end, run the service. There's a variety of ways to run things in Boot, but again, java-jar is one of them. And you're up and running with something on 8080 that's responding to your requests. So at that point, we don't have any delusions that you now completely understand building RESTful web applications with Spring, right? Building RESTful services with Spring. But that's why over in the sidebar, there's a menu of options for what's next, right? Maybe you're taking a broad kind of survey of what's available in Spring. So here are some other getting started guides that might be interesting to you that you want to spend another 15 minutes on. Or maybe you really are out to go build this service, right? So you want to dig into a tutorial that's going to walk you through in depth, in context, right? That's going to take more than 15 minutes. And what we've done with these, we have 3 now, and these were quite a bit of work to put together. But they're all based on a common domain, the Yummy Noodle Bar, which is actually a real place in the UK that the author of these likes to eat at. But they're blowing up, right? They're going global, so they want to have their menu online so that services like Yelp or whatever could talk to them. They want to integrate with basically get more traffic than just what they get from local foot traffic. So they're expanding their presence online. And so you help them build a RESTful web service. You help them get up and running with all kinds of different integration needs. You help build their web app. Those are all 3 different tutorials. And in any case, you still end up with working code. You still end up with, you can copy and paste your way to working code as you go. So no magic. And they're all still backed by an underlying repo that you can, and we hope you will, issue pull requests against, file issues against, right, if you find things or you want to fix a typo or whatever. In fact, these repositories, it's getting a little bit into the how, not so much the what, but what you're seeing here is actually being rendered directly from GitHub. It's kind of a fun implementation where we grab the underlying markdown from GitHub, and just with an accept header, we ask for the underlying markdown to be rendered as HTML, right? And we get it back and just do it right in line into the app. So when we make a change there, it's basically instantaneous. If we accept your pull request, you're going to see it show up on the website right away. We don't have to bounce the site for that or anything. Was there a question? I thought I saw your hand going up a couple times.
Yeah, back on the guide,
Mm-hmm.
you were saying to make it easy, you go with the jar. And I was wondering if it would make sense, if it would be smart to put in another mode switch to say, how do you actually deploy it as a war, since most people aren't deploying jars for websites.
Yeah, yet.
Yet.
But I mean, so I'll answer your question. The question is, what about another kind of switch? We're talking about having Gradle or Maven switches, depending on the build system you want to use. What about a switch that allows you to choose what kind of deployment style you want to do, right? And of course, even that's going to differ on the kind of app that you're building in the guide. If it's a web app, then jar or war is a reasonable switch. What we have for the moment, reasonable request, what we have for the moment is just a little call out, right? That here we're building a runnable jar, but if you want to build a classic war file instead, there's actually a guide for that, right? So converting a jar-based Spring Boot app to a war-based Spring Boot app. So not quite all singing, all dancing, but it is at least there with the explanation, right? Yeah. Okay, so other questions about the guides, getting started guides, tutorials? Yeah, in the back? Yeah, so you want to use Gradle as a build system, but you were saying in the enterprise it's not that friendly. How do you mean? Like Gradle itself trying to do dependency resolution or something. Aha, there's Hans Doctor in the house. Yeah, you really have to ask those guys. I mean, I think they're dealing with enterprises all the time. That's their biggest customer, so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the guides basically make the assumption that Gradle's working, and I think we're pretty confident it can, but it might take a little bit of config for proxies. Yeah? Yeah, maybe. Other questions? Yeah.
So you were saying if you're going through the guide and you click on the thing to show me the Maven, then it'll remember that the next time you come to any of the other guides, you'll see Maven?
Yeah, not yet. That's the aspiration. We just didn't make that for the cut for launch, but that's what we want to do in those guides is have that switch and just have a cookie that remembers it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We actually do use the Spring Boot plugin in the guides. If you see in the Maven or the Gradle, right? Am I missing anything, Greg?
No, it's basically it builds an Uber jar is what that plugin's core job is to do. And if you go to the guide that shows you how to convert it to a war file, it builds a war file, and the Spring Boot guys have made it a runnable war file also. So you can Java jar the war file or put the war file into a Tomcat container, a Jetty.
Mm-hmm. Was everybody able to catch that answer? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? Uh-huh.
Like I'm running this serving web content here in STS that I got from your site.
Mm-hmm.
And of course it runs flawlessly, but it's so terse and so magic. I mean, basically this Spring Framework does everything.
Mm.
So how about, is it possible to teach us how to do it without the boot? The old way?
Yeah. So the question is, he's going through one of the guides on serving web content, and boot is basically, it's really, really easy to get through, right? But then you ask the question, well, how is it doing this? How is it doing that? And the question was, is it possible to have a guide show you without the boot way, right? So, of course, this is one of those things where it's like, the balance is tough, right? Because we could have obviously gone with, here's how to do it without, or with minimal, help or magic, or here's the way to do it with Spring 3.1, 3.2, no boot involved. But then we'd be back in a situation where we're not showing off the latest and greatest, and people start looking and going like, oh, it's so verbose, right? So we wanted to focus on boot. And one of the things that's, I think, very important for boot, and I know they've started on this, is boot needs to have like the most comprehensive FAQ ever. How is boot doing this? How do I do this with boot? How do I get boot out of the way to do that, right? And then the team definitely understands that, right? So work in progress, but we probably won't create a whole set of guides that's like without boot and with boot, unless, of course, we got lots and lots of feedback saying that that's what people want. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll go ahead. One more question.
It's worth noting on the boot that in the boot conversations or talks with that they have a lot of opinions, but they're willing to get out of the way very easily as long as you know what to set and turn on, then whatever you turn on is what it is.
Yeah.
Going back to whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is that boot by design wants to get out of the way as quickly as possible. And I think we'll know that boot's own documentation is doing a good job if people are able to quickly self-serve and say, this is how I get boot out of the way, this is how I have my own opinion, right, without having to file an issue or ask a lot of questions about it. And it's just such early days right now, we don't know if we've done a great job, right? That's why we release all this stuff to you guys and let you tell us. Okay, so that's the guides. That's getting started guides and tutorials. And as we open source the site itself and it becomes the first reference app, we have at least one other reference app in mind, one that's actually already been built for a while that we call Spring Trader, which is a really non-trivial, sophisticated app that's basically a mock trading platform that we use to show off a whole lot of things in Spring and the other products that have been under VMware and that are now under Pivotal. So what you may see rather soon is a kind of third kind of guide, reference applications, right? That's if you think about the guides that you've seen here, they're kind of heavy on instruction and light on code. A reference application would be heavy on code and really annotated with prose, right? Pointing your eyes toward what's interesting in the code and helping to answer questions inside the context of a real-world app. That's what we want the reference apps to be. Okay, so moving right into the projects, Spring is at its heart, at its core, fundamentally a group of projects, right? That's what makes up Spring, and that's what makes up the Spring IO platform, right, is a bunch of open source projects that all have certain commonalities, right? A certain way of thinking about things, a certain way of doing things, a certain opinion about how things ought to be. And if you've been around Spring for a while and you've ever seen our GitHub repository, which we just renamed, you might have noticed, Spring Source, right, has now become Spring Projects. And we have some more refactoring to do here, but you see 150 repos, right? This is not helpful if you're just trying to get your head around Spring, or worse, if you're trying to convince that coworker about Spring. No, Spring's great, it's easy to use, just go get the code or whatever. No, 150 repos is like your head is just swimming. Right? And if you know what's going on with Spring and you have a sense and some history and context, you can quickly sift through this, and you know that things like Spring Boot and Spring Data, those are the projects themselves, and things like these ancillary projects that are supporting or samples or examples or whatever, you can discard those. But if you're a newcomer, you can't be expected to distinguish between those things. So one thing that we'll be doing is continuing to refactor our org situation so that if you are looking at GitHub, you see really just the projects themselves. That's why we called it Spring Projects. But that's already a level deeper than some people are going to want to go in the beginning. And that's why you see a really curated view here at the site, right? So don't think so much about repos. Think about the projects themselves. What value do they provide, right? What is Spring Batch about? What is Spring integration? about? How does it help you? Why would you care, right? And then, of course, dig in from there. So if you're interested in using AMQP for messaging, for example, you want to use Spring AMQP so that you can do AMQP-style messaging in a Spring way with things like templates and so on, right? That's what Spring AMQP is about. It should tell you about itself real quick, and then it should help you get started as quickly as possible, right? And that's this download widget, or basically get the bits widget, right? Get this on my class path in Maven or Gradle, like we saw earlier. And then these connect back to the other getting started guides and so on. You can see, right, for example, Spring Data, right? Spring Data is really a group of projects, a family of projects. So there, we're enumerating the child projects, whether it's JPA or Mongo or Hadoop, whatever kind of data work you're doing. You can see that over there on the right side, the projects actually link back into their own sample projects. So Spring Data JPA might have specific examples that show you how to do that. That might be off in its own repo somewhere, so link off to that. But if there are guides, getting started guides or tutorials that use Spring Data JPA, of course you want to have bidirectional linkage there. So, and just notice, right, just kind of thinking about the design of this, the name of that Getting Started guide is Accessing Data with JPA. That might be the thing that you're out to do. Again, it's not about Spring. You just need to talk to a relational database from a Java app, right? So that might be the thing that you're typing into Google. JDBC data access, JPA data access, right? That's what we want to show up in Google, right? As a highly search-ranked kind of thing is accessing data with JPA, and you click on that. And then, of course, along the way, you happen to use Spring Data JPA, because that's what we offer to do it. But Spring Data JPA is not the point, right? Accomplishing that development task is the point. So in some guides, you might use multiple Spring projects. The guides are not showcases for a project. The guides are a mechanism to help you get something done. Okay, so you can explore the projects. And then the blog, right? Everybody knows how a blog works. This works no differently. Just a couple of things worth mentioning. If you have been following the blog on a feed reader, right, of course those URLs have changed a little bit. It's all Atom feeds now, and you can slice and dice by just a few categories. We didn't want to have a whole bunch of tags and a whole bunch of categories. Just really simple. You can focus on what it is that you care about, either everything or just what's coming out of engineering, which is, if you've been watching the blog, that's what we basically mean by engineering posts. From the project leads, from the committers, talking about the technology, right? Sort of think pieces on some part of Spring or something that Spring is addressing. That's what we mean by engineering. Release announcements, right? We're typically dropping a lot of code. So every time something goes GA or a milestone, that's what we mean by releases. And then news and events might be things like, we have a webinar coming up, conferences that are coming up, Spring One itself, et cetera. So you can follow those, all in their own Atom feeds or all at once. And the entire blog history is there from the beginning, from the first blog post we ever had. Question? Yeah.
So you said that all of the content from this website is generated from Markdown pages?
It varies a little bit. The question is all of the content generated from Markdown? No, it depends page by page where you're looking. Here on the blog, now if I log in and make a new blog post, it's Markdown based, right? And then that gets translated to HTML. The old blog posts are coming out of WordPress, so they're basically HTML. The copy that you see on the site, if you're just looking at basically a static page, that's just text in HTML, in a template, in a Timeleaf template. The guides are all coming live out of GitHub. We're doing some caching in there as well, right? But you can think of it as just being slurped live from GitHub. The project pages, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't mention something about the project pages and where they live. If you notice, when I click that, we're still at spring.io/projects. But if we jump out to one of the projects themselves, notice what happens to the URL. We're at projects.spring.io now, and that's actually off of the site. This is actually no longer our app running. How many are familiar with GitHub's GH pages? Yeah, it's like GitHub's publication mechanism, really cheap and easy publication mechanism for essentially publishing a static site out of your project's Git repository. And it's a pretty cool, clever little way to do it. So if you think about it this way, this is the way that I like to think about it. What you're looking at on the site is like one side of a coin in that project's repo. The other side is the code itself. Right? And so if we click the GitHub banner here, we're looking at the repo for Spring Framework. If you look at the branches, so that's what's on master, right? That's, of course, the framework itself. But if you look at the branches, there's this GH Pages branch, and that's a well-known name. That's a convention in GitHub. What's interesting is in the GH Pages branch, it actually has nothing to do. There is no code for Spring Framework there. So this is actually like a zeroed out, cleared out branch that you then add HTML to, basically, or a static site of some sort. And GitHub has first-class support for Jekyll, which is a static site generator that GitHub also wrote. And so what these are Jekyll-based static HTML sites for each project, owned by the project, living inside the project's repo. And of course, the reason that we did this, one of the reasons that we did this, is to make it easy for the project leads to manage their own content. We didn't want the project leads to have to come in and make changes in the site in an HTML template or something like that. We didn't want them to, we want to deploy very, very often, but we don't want to deploy needlessly, right? That's just a punitive action to make us bounce the site if they want to tweak some text, right? So all the flexibility in the world, project leads can do what they want to do, but we have shared layouts and so on that they can pick up all the style from. And this is, aside from possibly being interesting, this is relevant to you because if you're seeing something on the project pages that could be improved or you have an idea, you could actually issue a pull request against the project itself, against the GH Pages branch to make that change. Any questions about that? Cool. Yeah. Yeah, so bears a little bit more explanation, actually, because there's a few moving parts there. If we look at the org, so the question is basically, say it again, how does it all join up, right? How does the site join up with the project pages if the project pages don't live on the site? And the first thing to think about is that we could have gone there in another way, right? We could have gone to springprojects.github.io/spring, whatever it is we want to see, AMQP. Now, notice the URL. It's going to redirect when I hit that. It redirects to projects.spring.io. This is actually still being served from GitHub. The reason that it redirects is because if you look at springprojects.github.io, that's actually a repo. Again, a kind of well-known naming convention-based repo. The name of your org, .github.io, anybody can do this. That's like the root site for this org. And all that's in that repository, really, is just an HTML page. Yep. Sorry? Oh, Zoom, yeah. Yeah, so all that's really in this org is an HTML page, right? And a CNAME file. And CNAME like DNS. And GitHub actually looks for that file. And they say, if you look like the GH Pages org level repo, springprojects.github.io, and you have a CNAME file, then I'll accept requests at that domain name, at that CNAME. I'll expect requests to come into me at projects.spring.io, and then whatever comes afterward, projects.spring.io/springamqp, that's going to be loaded up from the Spring AMQP, for example, their GH Pages. So it can take a little bit to get your head around, but it actually ends up being a really nice flexible system for us to have independence, and people can do whatever they want with their project pages, but then we also have a mechanism for sharing the layouts between them. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I could take more questions afterward too. Yeah, so that's the project pages. Yeah.
So the assets like CSS files and the overall page template,
Yeah.
is that shared across projects?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we share the assets across the project pages? I just mentioned that we do it, but I didn't explain how. So if you think about it again, you go to the main site and you get this, layout, header, footer, all of that. You go to projects, you go to Spring Framework, and it looks exactly the same. It looks like it's all on the same site. So obviously we're sharing some CSS there. Every project shouldn't have to repeat this, pixel for pixel, basically. So how we do that, if you know your way around Git, the word submodules might be coming into your head right now. And if you know Git submodules, you're hoping, oh God, no, I hope they didn't use Git submodules, because that's really a world of pain. We didn't. What we use is github.com/spring projects. We actually have a repository. This might be a little bit confusing. We actually have a repository called GHPages. That's the shared GHPages repository. And it contains essentially all of those common layouts, common CSS, all the common Jekyll stuff. That GHPages branch you can think of, that GHPages repo you can think of as the upstream, in the Git sense, the upstream repository for all of the GHPages branches across the projects. So if we make a change to the layout, we just make it here, and then all of the project leads get an email. We have a webhook set up here that when changes are made to this repo, an email goes out to all of the owners of the other repos saying, hey, there are layout changes, right? Merge this in. So they just merge it in when they have the time, when they care to. Okay, so that's projects, right? We talked about the blog. The forum I didn't mention, I don't know if you've dug into it since the keynote. The forum is essentially the same forum that we've always known, right? Many, 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 many thousands of users. I think really tens even. I think we've even had something like 100,000 users over time in the forums that have had a login. So all of those accounts are still there, et cetera. We've upgraded it to vBulletin 5, which, vBulletin hasn't been the greatest in the world at being a modern platform for forums, but VB5 did do a bit of a better job updating some things. So we've been pretty happy so far. Looking forward to feedback, but of course, the most visible thing that you see is that we've just skinned it to look and feel like the rest of the site. Done some cleanup of the taxonomy in the forums, and maybe most importantly, we've added new levels of spam control. So, what we're trying to do is make sure that this is a place that's useful for everybody, that the project leads want to hang out in, that people want to ask questions in. And so, today it's been a little bit hit and miss, right? Depends on the forum. Some forums are really heavily watched by the project leads and have lots of really fruitful conversations with users and so on, and some have languished over the last months and years, right? So we've decided to double down on the forums. When we started out on this, there was a very strong push by yours truly to axe the forums and go to Stack Overflow. Actually just blow the whole thing away, right? And let people scream if they were going to scream. Because, Stack Overflow is obviously, everybody in this room, I'm sure if you're a developer, uses Stack Overflow, so why not just embrace that? And we decided in the end to actually keep the forums around because while Stack Overflow is great, and we do embrace it, and we want people to use it, there's a level of interaction that you can only have in your own forum, right? A level of curation, a level of control. And there really are so many users that we decided in the end to keep it around. So watch this space, right? Because for me, we're not done until this is spam-free and completely supported. Like a cop on the beat, right? And they're really helping people out like their job. And so that's something that we're going to keep working on. So if you haven't been around the forums lately, come back, give it a try. Let us know how it goes. And with that, let's see what else there is on the site to talk about. Of course, the team page, you saw me talk about that. Get to know the team there. services, what we do professionally, commercially. You can check all of that out. And then the tools pages, you want to go get STS, you want to go get the Groovy and Grails tool suite. Of course, all those downloads are still available there. So, any other questions about the what so far, the functionality of the site? Yeah.
When you're talking about that accessing data JPA,
Mm-hmm.
I imported it into STS and I ran the completed, and the POM has an error, or Spring Framework is invalid name on this platform. So when that happens, where do you go to get some help on that?
So the question is, so by the way, these guides are designed to be imported into STS pretty cleanly. Spring Tool Suite, that's what I mean by STS. They've actually built some custom support for getting them into the IDE easily. And your question was, you were running through it and the POM file came up and had some kind of error, right? Who knows exactly what that is, but how do you get that fixed, right? How do you basically file an issue about that? So the idea is, and of course this is all brand new, so let's see how this goes, is that if you were in accessing data with JPA, was that the guide?
GS accessing data JPA.
Yeah, so let's just go there, right? So ostensibly, you were going through, you decided that you wanted JPA, something with JPA, accessing data with JPA. So you could have just walked through it, you could have been walking through this in STS, but you found something wrong, right? So the thing to do would be to go to the repository and notice where this is, right? It's not in Spring Projects that I was showing you earlier, it's in Spring Guides. Again, trying to separate things out so we don't have hundreds of repos in one place. That GS, getting started, this is actually how we load up the getting started guides into an index. We're looking for every repo that starts with GS. That's how we make the listing. So GS accessing data JPA, and you would go create an issue, right? And the person who's leading or responsible for that particular guide would hopefully respond to you and help you work that out, right? Another way that we might want to go here, because there are so many guides, it might be a little bit like herding cats on some of those issues, especially if they're kind of meta issues. Like I have a question not about this guide, but about how to use all guides. We may set up something in the forums that's kind of dedicated to talking about the guides. Haven't done it yet, but just looking for the feedback, and we'll see what we do next. Was there another question before we move on? Yeah.
What's the number in the corner of the project?
Ah,
Spring data has a 7 on it.
yeah. This was a matter of some debate whether it was inherently clear what that meant. I was of the opinion it was not inherently clear what that meant. So thanks for the validation. So projects, right? That is, so some don't have a number, some have a number. It's a number of sub-projects. So Spring Data has Data JPA, Data Mongo, Hadoop, and so on. Yeah, it's just telling you that basically, it's intended to tell you that if you click here, you're going to go into another level where you make a next level of choice about what you want to see. I will gleefully let my cohorts know.
That's a meta issue.
One for the forum, right? Yeah, cool. Okay. Okay, so sure we could play around in some other areas, but that's, that really is the grand tour. And yeah, well, we hope you find that useful, and we definitely look forward to feedback on that. So, what next? Well, let's get into the how, right? A lot of different aspects of how we built the site. So we'll talk about a few of them and play around with some things along the way. So one, I mentioned in the keynote that we manage this in the quote pivotal way, which is the way that the Pivotal Labs talks about how they do agile. And there's nothing terribly revolutionary here, right? We probably all have an understanding of the tenets of agile software development, and I don't need to tell you that. But the thing that made it different for me, anyway, was just how serious isn't quite the right word, because it's not like a very serious environment, but just how seriously they take it, right? It isn't a halfway, almost Scrum or whatever, with a whole bunch of compromises being made. They've really hardened their approach in the fire of countless, customer engagements. And so for me coming into it, and I was playing the role of product owner or project manager, however you like to call it, but they call it product owner. So I kind of came into it pretty green about the way that they do things, and they really trained me how to think, and I'm so thankful for it. I really learned a lot. I really learned what it means to prioritize things in a way and at a level that I never had before. And a lot of how they do that is through the tool that they use. How many have ever seen or used Pivotal Tracker? Yeah, well, yeah, the people who helped build the site have definitely used it, right? Yeah, Pivotal Tracker is definitely not trying to be all things to all people, but it's really about if you're out to build something, get something done at a deadline, right? It's a fantastic tool, and I don't know if we'll have time, but I'd be happy to show anybody around it. It really was the lifeblood of kind of keeping this thing under control over the last 6 months. And things like continuous deployment from day one, right? The very first day that we started this out, we had some version of the app up, and we've never had it down since, right? Again, things that you would probably do on any new project or that you would want to do, but that's actually how we built it. And one of the things that I really wanted to do when we were building this is, it sounds like some cheesy marketing thing, manage everything in the cloud. But that word actually means something these days, right? When I say manage everything about this effort in the cloud, I mean, I wanted to have a world where everything around the site itself, of course, but everything that we use to manage the site, like monitoring and alerts and logging and all of that stuff, I wanted to have it all in browser tabs, right? I wanted to have it all in a set of bookmarks that I could just manage from anywhere I was in the world, on my phone or whatever. Even things like DNS, right? I didn't want to have some bind server running in a dark corner of some data center that somebody has the lock and key to that I can never see, right? I want to be able to manage DNS from a web app. And I'll get into some of that, some of the tools that we use to do that. But fundamentally, you could wrap all of that up and say that this is kind of what I meant earlier when I was saying, take a step back and relearn what it means to build something like a web app like this in an utterly modern way. And we had a lot of fun along the way doing it. So we'll get into some of these tools, right? Just take a quick tour of them, actually. The first one is HipChat, maybe next to Pivotal Tracker. HipChat really made a difference. How many have ever used this? HipChat, yeah. Yeah, so, and if you haven't used HipChat, I mean, it's, again, nothing totally revolutionary. It's essentially a modern IRC. But it has just a number of sweet little features that make a huge difference when you're a globally distributed team trying to get something done, right? So this is HipChat, right? It has clients for Mac and Windows, and it has a web client and all that stuff. And the internal project name for this was Sagan. And so you can see there we have, this is actually really interesting, right? Like inside of, this is basically Pivotal's HipChat. So you can see all of the rooms where the Cloud Foundry team are talking to each other, all the teams where the Spring folks are talking to each other, all the rooms where, you've heard about things like Reactor and Rabbit, where those guys talk to each other. And what's really cool is, in a company of 1,000 people or so, Phil says, zoom it up. Right? I don't know if I can zoom this one, but thanks. Right? Actually, let's just see. I don't know. Can I? Yeah, I don't think there's any way to do it. But I'll zoom in when I actually do something. So for example, here's the development room in which I should probably say, hey, Gonzalo. So Gonzalo is in London. And so they're just finishing their day working on stuff on the site. And you can see some of the recent commits, right? So this was David Freermore, right? We've got this hooked up to GitHub so that we see the commits coming in, when they come in. And what I really want to say is you should say hi to everyone. We're in a session on the site. And really sorry I didn't get stories into Tracker for you. I was preparing. We'll see if they respond. right? But that's how we managed the whole thing, whether it was in San Francisco or Santa Monica, where David was, or London, or Vienna, where I live. We were all rallying around this all the time. And HipChat just has some little things, Gonzalo says, hey, that really help. Like, if you've ever uploaded a file, there's a list of all the files, right? Any links that you've posted show up in this links bar. I don't know why it's not showing at the moment. History forever that you can search through and get back to anything. You can plug just about anything in. GitHub, we have our CI plugged into this, so it just becomes really, next to Tracker, the lifeblood of what's happening in the project, and you can get online when you wake up and scroll back through and look at everything that happened over the day. I wouldn't want to manage it any other way after having done it. Yes. Yeah.
Are you able to have private conversations in there, or is it the whole group is seeing everything?
Yeah, the question is, can you have private conversations? Yes, that's what Phil was just doing here, right? Was saying, zoom it up, right? And that was just to me. It might be interesting, we've used Skype for years, and we still do. He's saying you can join a Hangout, because we also use Google Hangouts. We actually still use Skype, right? This hasn't been a complete replacement for us, because it just turns out that the different tools have different strengths. Like here, there's no voice, basically. And you can have a private conversation, but you can't really add other people easily into the private conversation. So while it's not ideal to have two chat clients going on, most of us still do have it running. HipChat is just strong enough to keep itself there as the team tool, right? The kind of just every moment of every day tool, and then we'll switch over to Skype if we want to have the things that Skype is a little bit better at. You sometimes see online like HipChat or Skype, bake-offs, and for us the answer is both. And that's another thing that we use since Gonzalo mentioned it, is Hangouts, Google Hangouts. How many have ever used that? Yeah, this one's a bit of a love-hate relationship for us, actually. It's been useful enough. I mean, that's how we do our stand-ups, right? In the agile sense, our stand-up meetings every morning, depending on where you live. Morning for me, evening for San Francisco, right? That kind of thing. We all do actually get on Hangouts, see each other's faces, right? Talk to each other. This is great, but it's just no substitute for human face-to-face communication. And so that's been a great thing, and that's why we keep using Hangout. But the problem is that sometimes it just doesn't work, and sometimes people can't hear the audio, and so it's about a quarter of the time we're really frustrated with it. But hopefully they'll keep making it better. It's basically pulled its weight so far. So HipChat, Hangouts, Tracker. Right, I'll just give you a little glimpse of what Tracker looks like. We use 3 instances of Tracker, one for each, kind of like you just saw those 3 rooms, Sagan backend, Sagan frontend, and Sagan content. That was the front-end dev, the back-end dev, and the people writing the guides. So similarly, we had 3 pivotal trackers, instances. Sagan backend, that's what you're looking at here. And I won't go into all the details here. Tracker takes a little bit to get your head around when you first use it, but once you do get some capability with it, it's a really fast and efficient tool for getting lots of stories, right, or issues in, and just managing them, and it's just designed around absolutely ruthless prioritization. For example, there's no due dates to speak of. You can create a release that has a due date. But issues, stories can't have due dates because mostly due dates are BS, right? Mostly due dates just get blown. But what you can have, what's definitely not BS, is this is more important than that, right? This is more important than that, so you stack rank it. You put this, Rod Johnson's Gravatar was broken, right? Is that the most important thing? No, that's why we didn't do it for launch, right? That's why it was always below the line. And and if we create a new story, just show people Tracker, right? And if that were a feature on the site, right, it's not. This would probably be a chore because it's not a user-facing thing, right? But if this were a feature, we'd assign it to somebody, I'll assign it to myself, and then the job is to estimate that, right? Estimate it 1 point, 2 point, 3 point. You can have different estimation scales, but again, if you've been around the kind of agile world, that's just a a metric that's meaningless until your team gives it meaning. Hey, as a team, this feels like a 3-pointer. As a team, this feels like a 1-pointer. And once you've done that, once you go through your whole backlog and you've pointed things out, things start to get really interesting. You start to get great velocity metrics and so on. If you've ever tried to run a Scrum team and really do things like velocity, Tracker is just so custom built to nail this down and get it just right. You really have to invest your time to get great at it, but once you do, it's so worth it. So check it out. It's free, right? Anybody can use it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's free. Yeah, that wasn't a product pitch. Just actually enjoyed using it.
You're using that, does that tie back to Jira in any way? So when issues come up on Jira, you end up working them?
Yeah, the question is there a link between this and Jira? There are like integrations for Tracker, for Jira and GitHub, like you saw. But we didn't manage the site at all in Jira. So the site itself is just in Tracker. So there was no need for an integration, basically. Anything existing, the question is, do we plan to move other project work to that? Anything existing, probably not. We wouldn't move Spring Framework, and it's 10,000 issues over to Tracker. It would just be senseless. But as people are working on new work, they basically have the choice. Really, project leads have the choice. Continue to use Jira, and things like Greenhopper, which has now changed its name, but Jira's solution there. Use GitHub Issues if you think you can manage it. GitHub Issues is kind of like not the most feature-rich thing in the world, so that might not be enough for a Spring project. Or use Tracker, and Tracker can be, this one is private, but it can be made public, right? So you can have an open source, kind of Tracker instance. And we may do that with this one when we open source the rest of it. Yeah, if you didn't hear it on the video, Dave was saying that Spring Boot was built using Tracker, which I think was pretty good, again, like getting to a finish line, but you want to have a finish line with Tracker, and when you're having an open source project that maybe has lots of issues over time, and the whole idea with Tracker is to just burn down through the backlog, get issues out of the way. So it's really right tool for the job, making that decision. Okay, so let's move on, because we have, I think, some fun things to try in a minute. So I do want to mention some of these other things that we used, though, and none of these people are paying us to do anything. In fact, we're mostly paying them. Obviously, GitHub, talked to you a lot already about the integrations with GitHub, and obviously they're doing the code hosting. Flood.io, this is something that we found actually fairly late in the game. We did a lot of performance testing, but we came across Flood toward the end of our performance testing. It was just a really nice, really clean, cloud-based performance testing service that can take, you can just manually set something up, or it can take JMeter XML, nice UI, nice reports, really powerful, and really helped us get the site to a place where it's stable. Cloudflare, how many of you used Cloudflare, are familiar with that? Cloudflare is a really interesting CDN, basically. So in between you and all requests to Spring.io itself is Cloudflare, right? It's a network of proxies, caching proxies, but it's a really smart network of proxies. So they can do all kinds of stuff like DDoS detection and protection, all kinds of interesting security stuff. Obviously, caching stuff. That's maybe the primary purpose of a content delivery network. And it's been great. They do our SSL hosting for us. They do our DNS for us. So I was saying, I wanted to manage everything from a browser tab. Here is that set of bookmarks, right? If I want to get into Cloudflare and go change a DNS record, we can just do that, right? Let's see. My websites, right? Spring.io, DNS, right? Reads just like his own file. This actually came from his own file, but on the web. That's so nice. I can actually change it from my phone. Maybe that's dangerous, right? But and Cloudflare is really sophisticated, right? Whether or not this cloud is orange is whether or not your app is on the CDN network. So I could actually just take it off the CDN network and go direct to the origin server at any time. Can flip it into it can purge the cache at any time if you're getting caching issues. Set it in development mode to start bypassing the cache. You can do really all kinds of stuff. It minifies your JavaScript, your CSS for you if you want it to, right? You can have really aggressive optimization settings where it's in the middle, helping, get your content to be as fast, to page load times as possible. That's been, I think, a big help. A few other ones. Obviously, Cloud Foundry is running the whole thing. New Relic, I'm actually really looking forward to talking to the New Relic guys. New Relic is plugged into the site. So how many of you are familiar with New Relic? Yeah, okay, right? Yeah, let's talk afterward, because I need some education. But basically, we see all of the stats for the requests per minute and that kind of thing up in New Relic, and that's happening through the Cloud Foundry marketplace. So it's actually just a service that we bound to the app, and it just works. After a little bit of tweaking with Boot, it just works now, and it will work for you too if you're using Boot. One of the many things that we actually had to fix when we were using it in anger, right? Drone is a nice, lightweight, little cloud-based CI service that we use to test all of the guides. The code underneath all the guides is all CI tested through Drone. Splunk, we're spooling off all of our logs to Splunk. A little Bonsai is Elasticsearch. The search on the site, which we didn't take a look at, is all backed by Elasticsearch. Of course, we used Spring to build the whole thing. Google Analytics, right? A lot of fun. It's such a great time to build this sort of thing. The tools are so mature and so basically enjoyable to use. Through the Drone.io setup, can I walk you through that? Actually, I want to do something that'll probably take the next 15 minutes. So if we have some time afterward, I'd be happy to. Because what I want to do now is, when we talk about how, this is a great maxim, right? I actually hate to be quoting Mark Zuckerberg, but this is from Facebook, right? And that's really a great way to think about things. If you can build an app in a way that, deploying is cheap and rolling back is just as cheap, then you can move fast and you don't have to worry if you break things. So, anybody want to try to break something? Move fast, right? Let's give it a shot. So we have some changes sitting here in the repo that haven't been pushed live on the site. And how many actually loaded up the site on your mobile device before? Okay, good. So keep that there. I'll have you refresh it in a minute. When we did the keynote the other night, the thing that we did on stage was we actually had the blue and the green version of the app up and running, and one version, green, didn't have auth turned on, and one version, blue, had auth enabled. So we were just really toggling between those two apps. Pretty simple operation in Cloud Foundry. It's just mapping a URL, mapping and unmapping a URL between those two things in the right order so that it never goes down. What I didn't show you is actually pushing something to Cloud Foundry, right? Actually doing a deployment. And what we have here, so this is the code base, and sitting in that code base, let's just see where we are. Yeah, so I've just when I was setting up, I merged a branch in called responsive. All right, and that's some work that David, who was actually with us at the keynote in the audience, one of the pivots that was working on this, he's been working hard on the responsiveness, right? Mobile responsiveness, so that when you're on a mobile device, that the site does everything you might expect the site to do, or when you're in a very small browser window, that it does everything you might expect it to do, so that you don't have to scroll horizontally and so on. That's what we mean by responsive here. So those changes are in. They've been tested, right, to some reasonable extent. And what we want to do now is actually push them live. So we have 15 minutes. We should have enough time to do that. Check it out, see how it goes. And if it all blows up, roll back, right? Okay, so what we do to make this happen is it's all just Cloud Foundry commands underneath, right? But we wrap this up in a build script called deploy. Let me make this bigger. Can you guys see that? Is that big enough text? It's about as big as it goes, I think. Yeah, can you guys see it in the back? Good enough, okay. So deploy blue, green, right, is this little shell script that we use to basically script a conversation with Cloud Foundry, with the Cloud Foundry console tool, right, the CF tool. We log in, right, log in as our user, make sure that we're in the right space, right? We have different spaces, production, deployment, performance, etc. So in this thing that I'll show you here, we'll switch into the production space. And then we'll ask Cloud Foundry, basically, which one of those two apps, blue or green, which one is running right now? Which one is active right now? Which one is actually serving requests right now? And it'll come back and say, looks like Sagan Green is the one that's active. And then we'll say, all right, well, we're going to deploy Sagan Blue. And then that's what happens right here. So the app currently running is Sagan whatever. Next thing is push, right? CF push, using a particular manifest file, push up to production Sagan Blue. And you'll see that happening. And then when that's all done, which might take a few minutes, then we'll run a mapping script. So the thing that maps all the URLs. And when I did this in the keynote, the only URL really that we mapped was spring.io. But in fact, this little app running from built on Spring Boot, running from java-jar, this little app is actually accepting all requests for all of our legacy domains, with the exception of springsource.org. I haven't moved it over yet. But static.springsource.org, blog.springsource.org, even interface21.com, those are all coming into the site right now. So it's important that we map over all of the URLs, right? And that's what that little script will do. So let's give that a go. If we look at target, yeah, I've already built the site just beforehand. So let's give it a go. Let's say deploy, blue-green, right? And production, we want to do this to production. And let's see what happens. So it's switching the space, right? In case we weren't already in the context of production, it's switching in there. It's checking to see which app is running. So you can see all the different domains. Again, sort of top level, second level domains here. We have individual subdomains mapped off of those, like www and blog. And so on. But those domains are all mapped into this space. Cloud Foundry can and will handle requests for those domains. So it said, the one that's running right now is Sagan Green. And we can verify that again, like we showed in the keynote, just looking at info. Right, that should tell us that Sagan Green is running, and it still is. We're deploying over there in the other window, but if all this goes well, nothing will go down. You can see it load balancing between the 4 instances of Sagan Green that are up and running. You can see which was the latest commit, right? So 3FE is the latest commit that's running there. Just go to another window and say, git log, right? Look for that. And we can see through the log which one is actually running. Okay, so Sagan Green. So now it's uploading. So it was uploading Sagan Blue. It's uploading the new version of the site. Sagan Blue was already running, right? It uploaded the new app, and now that the app is uploaded, it stops Sagan Blue. Because of course it's going to restart it with the new code. So let's just see that in the console. Run.pivotal.io, right, takes us into the console. Production space, Sagan Blue is down. That's what we expect. Sagan Green is still up and running, still up and serving, no problem. But in the background, Sagan Blue is now starting up. So we're doing all this based on build packs. Anybody go to the build pack oriented talks? Have they happened yet, actually? Yeah, right. So build packs, how many of you used Heroku? A few, right? So Heroku's build pack model is the same build pack model that Cloud Foundry uses now. So we're using the Java build pack. Has, all works very nicely with Spring-based apps, with Boot-based apps, right? We really made sure that that integration is in now. And so 4 instances, right? 2 versions of the app, blue and green, 4 instances each. And so one of those instances is already running. You can see that through the UI. Should say something like 25, 50%, right? Because now 2 are running, 3 are running, 1's still starting. And we could get into let's say cf logs Sagan Blue. The new app is running, but we haven't mapped over the domains yet, right? So if we are still hitting this at /info, we probably still see Sagan Green. The new app is up, but it hasn't been mapped over yet. That's happening right about now, right? Binding Spring IO to Sagan Blue, unbinding Spring IO from Sagan Green. It should now say Sagan Blue, right? And the site should be up. And if you refresh your phones, you should see a responsive layout. Any luck? Someone try refreshing their phone. Okay, great. Yeah? Nice. And how about, looks like there might be a few issues. So somebody tell me an issue that you see. Some of the graphics aren't loading. Okay, for example?
Like everything in that green section? Yeah.
In green section, right?
It looks like the header is loaded correctly, but that's feeling better.
Yep.
Enterprise graphic is still the old one.
Okay. So this could be a couple of things, right? This could be caching, because some of these assets changed in the responsive mode. So maybe it would have been a good idea to set Spring.io into development mode. We could actually do that right now and see if that makes a difference.
You load the page in a browser tab, and you can make the browser window smaller, and you
Yeah.
can see the rendering issues.
Yeah, exactly. I actually did see him. I wanted you guys to say it. Right. So Cloudflare settings, right? Development mode. This is for Spring.io. So let's turn it on and see what happens. Nope, doesn't seem to quite be there. Let's just bring it up in an incognito window just in case. Right? Still having some issues. So it's responsive, right? But not quite like we expected. Let's try one more thing before we roll back. Let's try purging the cache. Development mode probably should have done this, but just in case. It works, sorry? Yeah, so you did a hard reload and it's responsive now. Does it have any of these little issues anymore?
Yeah, the graphics are loading better.
Okay. So that might be development mode kicking in, coincidentally with a hard refresh, or maybe it was really the hard refresh. In any case, it sounds like it's working. So I'm going to bring this up in Safari. Spring.io. Right, so that should be looking nice. Yay. Cool. So that's exactly what it looks like. That's what we've done, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times since the keynote, just making little changes. And one of the changes, one of the series of changes that we've been doing is, like I said, mapping over the domains, right? From the legacy domains, routing them all into this app. And you might wonder, well, why do that exactly? Well, if it's the blog, of course, the blog is actually now on this app, so it makes a lot of sense to route requests from blog.springsource.org into this application. But think about the other things that have changed, like docs.spring.io used to be static.springframework.io. We're actually doing those redirects inside this app. So if you've ever used the URL rewrite filter that's out there for years and years for Java, it's actually a really lightning fast, nice regex-based model for doing any kind of rewrite, just kind of like Apache rewrite rules. So this little app is serving up all of those rewrites as well. And you can see those flying by, right? Static dot, and that's issuing a 302, and then they're off to docs.spring.io. So again, when we finish up here, we'll do one more, one more deploy here pretty quick, or one more change in Cloudflare, and we'll start switching over springsource.org. So maybe take one last look at it and say goodbye, right? It'll all be spring.io after that. Okay, so we'll let that run. You might wonder what that instances down is all about up here. That's the indexer. That's a second app that's running. That's the indexer that runs our search, or that rather indexes our pages and gets them into Elasticsearch. And this is a good example of the real world that we've been dealing with in Cloud Foundry. So much great stuff, right? But sometimes pushes take a long time. Sometimes they're really quick, like you saw a moment ago, and sometimes they just wait and wait and wait, right? Great, big, distributed system sometimes decides to have its own opinions about things, right? And this is all, these guys have been working so hard on this. This is all running on AWS now. Run.pivotal.io is. I was just talking to some guys the other day who run, Cloud Foundry on their own. I'm sure, Mike, you could tell people a lot about this. Running on top of vSphere, pushes are always lightning fast, right? But when you're on top of a system like AWS, maybe the underlying hardware, as it were, decides to take a while. So anyway, we've got lots of defensive code in that little script, and this will eventually catch up, and it'll eventually deploy. But we won't bore you with that. The point is that the app itself is up, and it's responsive. So we have just a few minutes. Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
You're using Bash for this, and I'm wondering if, in terms of schema changes, you're actually doing also proprietary, bashing for that?
We're using batching. Was that it?
No, Bash.
Bash, yeah. Yeah. And for schema changes, like database schema changes. Yeah, we're using Liquibase. Anybody use Liquibase? Yeah. Are you familiar with how it works? Liquibase basically has a series of change sets, right? Like the creation of the tables, any modifications to the tables that have happened over time. And those change sets are actually stored in a database, in your database, which, by the way, is Elephant SQL, Postgres, also being bound through the Cloud Foundry marketplace. Pretty nice little service. But Liquibase just helps with database migrations, schema changes. Actually pretty nice. Yeah?
So I was wondering if before you swap the URL, the routing,
Yeah.
green, blue,
Right. From blue to green, yeah.
this is kind of a Cloud Foundry question. Could you, as the developer,
Mm-hmm.
gone to that other site, the site that was down, and looked at it and verified it before you switched it to the world?
Yes, yeah, indeed. The conservative thing to have done, right, if I wasn't interested in stagecraft, would have been to actually go look at the new site before you switch things over. Yeah, of course, maybe deploy it to staging first, right? Don't even deploy it to production yet, yeah. So yes, you definitely can do that. Yeah?
With every decent sized site I've ever built, you get about 65, 70% in, and you realize, oh crap, I wish we'd done this, that differently.
Yeah.
What are a couple things you guys didn't have time to change?
Yeah, so the question is, like, if we did it all over again, what would we do differently, basically? Because you get to that some point, and it's like, you realize you only have so much time left, and we wasted time on this, and we should have spent time on that. I would have taken the prioritization skills that I ended up with at the end and used them from the beginning, right? For example, just a couple of things. Like, a couple of things that you don't see on the site right now are like a jobs page, Like we, put together a jobs page and, designed it and all of that stuff, but just didn't have it completely ready, not ready enough for launch. And it's ultimately expendable, right? And so at the last minute, before we went live, I just deleted that from the nav, and it's gone, and it'll come back someday. You can still apply for a job in the meantime. But, that made me realize that was never essential, right? We should have just deferred that thing the whole time. Things like that, right? And there are probably, dozens of other examples. But, things where I was really stubborn, I really want this, but in the end, what did we sacrifice? What we ended up sacrificing was responsiveness on day one. That was really supposed to be done for the keynote. Of course, the experience I wanted people to have was to look at their phones when I announce it and go, oh, and it does the right thing, right? And that was literally because we messed about, with some other things that we could have waited on, right? So, no harm done, hopefully. But okay, I think we're about time. But one last question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you're building a Spring MVC app, right, inside of... Yeah, so the question is basically when do I, as a practitioner, start using this stuff, right? In your own apps, in your own company, in your own projects that you're working on? Well, pretty clearly, early days, right? One thing that we wanted to do this year for Spring 1 was we wanted everything that we bring to the table to be essentially RC quality or better, or real close, right? Boot is right now in milestone 4. You know, we're getting real close to that kind of release candidate phase and then GA. So exact timeline, don't have an exact timeline, but aggressively moving forward toward that. Of course, we wouldn't recommend you go into production until it's GA. And along with that GA will be, you know, making sure that we have all the gaps filled in on docs so that all those questions are really easy to answer. But that's very much that's the right question. We hope that you want to, and we'll help make it easy. I think we should break, and I can answer questions afterward. Thank you so much for coming.